Well, hello and welcome to another Aussie Wire Deep Dive. My name's Topher Field. For those that aren't familiar with me, I am the host of the Aussie Wire News. I'm the Australian Libertarian of the Year. I'm the multi-award-winning director of Battleground Melbourne, the author of Good People Break Bad Laws. Always have a copy handy, and many other things. But you know what? You're not actually here to listen to me. You're here to hear from our guest. And our guest today is David Cotter. Now, this is going to be a really, really fun conversation because David is a young guy with a remarkable set of accomplishments to his name. He is an accomplished classical musician, literally performing at a world-class level. He's also an academic. He is an author. And if I may be so bold, he's a bit of a tech nerd, and there's some fascinating stuff that he's done involving robot playing guitars, involving NFTs, electronic music more generally. And I just think this is going to be a really entertaining conversation. So without further ado, here is my guest for today's deep dive, David Cotter. Thank you so much for coming on.
Good morning, Topher. It's good to be with you.
Now, I've got to start with the elephant in the room. You are a professional musician, and I don't know what Europe is like. Maybe it's a bit different over there. But in Australia, if you go to your parents and say, hey, I want to be a professional musician, what they hear is that you want to be broke and poor and lonely and cry yourself to sleep in your mum's basement every single night. Is there actually really a career pathway in Europe in classical music?
I mean, there certainly is, but it's a slim one. I mean, you can draw it on socioeconomic lines as well. I mean, I can imagine this is obviously a generalization, but a lot of working class boys and girls, if they were to say that to their parents, then it might be met with that kind of response. Whereas if you've got the money, you can indulge in, let's call them the liberal arts more generally, that kind of path. So I would say this very much depends on what you mean by classical music.
Sure.
So classical music in the historic sense, if we're thinking tailcoats, we're thinking classical piano, we're thinking string quartets, that is a very, very small part of the musical jigsaw in the 21st century. But if we think about film music, if we think about advertisements, if we think about television, we think about electronic music, instrumental music, dance music, these boundaries are pluralistic, they're osmotic. So if we conceive of music in that way, then there are a lot more opportunities available, or at least that's what we tell ourselves.
Well, certainly a classical training, a classical background is one of the things that is common to many world-class musicians who then branch out into all kinds of other genres. One of my personal favourite bands, certainly from when I was in my 20s, was Apocalyptica, a set of classically trained cellists who then went on to do sort of heavy metal music and covers of AC/DC and all sorts of really entertaining stuff. Educate me though. I heard, I was at the O2 in London in November. You opened for Jordan Peterson there. How would you describe the sorts of music and the sorts of pieces that you were playing to set the mood and prepare people for a Jordan Peterson event?
Well, Jordan's always been very kind. He's always put the ball in my court. Whenever I've said, "What do you want?" he's always said, "No, this is your show. What do you want?" And so, of course, there's been a process of going back and forth here to decide what works best. And so, when I started supporting him, it was very much an all classical repertoire. But that's been expanded. I mean, he turned around to me in January of this year, and he said, "How about Toccata and Fugue?" And I said, "Well, great piece, but on the classical guitar, it's not quite the right vessel for that a piece of that magnitude. You need an organ or an electric guitar." And so as time's gone on now, the kind of set I've been doing has basically been starting with the classical guitar on stage, playing Bach, playing Boccherini, things that are very much in the canon, and then getting the electric guitar out as we move through the set, just lighting up the place a little bit. And as you said, it's the O2 Arena. So it's one thing to draw people in with the kind of like the insular kind of small sound of the classical guitar, but it's another thing just to crank it up and wake people up.
Well, I think that's one of the things that I really appreciated about your work when I did see you live at the O2 was this, a brilliant classical musician playing a classical guitar before a Jordan Peterson speech is somewhat playing to the stereotype, if I may be a little bit offensive. It's if you thought about what music is going to be played before a Jordan Peterson event, you go, oh well, yeah, okay, that makes sense. And then you put that guitar down, you got an electric guitar, and you lightened the place up without question. So the thinking behind that, there's a lot more depth to what goes into something like pre-show music or preparatory music. What's the process there for you? I mean, you were interested in Jordan Peterson long before you started working with him. Perhaps start by telling us a bit about the book that you actually wrote, and why it was that you even proposed to him having music as an opening to his show, and what you thought that would achieve.
So there's a book that came out in, let's say, 2021, but that's probably wrong, a few years ago, called Jordan Peterson Critical Responses. And indeed it was an edited volume of critical responses. So there were about 20 chapters, and some of them were favorable and some of them were somewhat negative, and various qualities, and there are aspects of mine which I'm not particularly happy with, but whatever, that's publishing. That's getting content out there. That's the nature of the game. And so I wrote a chapter in that called The Musical Mediation of Order and Chaos.
Okay.
Because anyone who knows Jordan knows, or is familiar with his teachings, knows that he talks about order and chaos. He brings in the kind of the Taoist, the Buddhist, the Jungian elements of these eternal elements, and talks about them in relation to how they pertain to our lives at various levels of resolution. And I thought there was a space there to talk about how we as performers mediate order and chaos in real time. And so I wrote that, and I was fortunate to be put in touch with him when he came to Cambridge through some very, very good family friends. And we took the conversation from there. Our first conversation, we traversed Supertramp, magic mushrooms. We talked about a whole gamut of things. And he was coming. He had an invitation to come and speak at the Cambridge Union, which is a very kind of prestigious debating chamber, and do some university lectures. The first time the university invited him, that invitation was rescinded, and that garnered a lot of worldwide attention. But a free speech bill, so to speak, was passed at Cambridge, and then he was re-invited, and he spent some time here, and he wanted some music to open his talks. And at that stage, we weren't necessarily sure what that was going to look like. Were they going to be integrated into the talk, or was it going to be purely background music? But if it's purely background music, then you relegate it, and maybe that's worse than having no music at all. So these are the kinds of questions that we began playing with. And then over time, when I was supporting him on the 12 More Rules for Life tour, it kind of crystallized into this, this canonical kind of Bach, that kind of repertoire that you would expect. I think that's Jordan's favorite composer. And then it's gone from there. But there were reasons for we discussed this at length, and we continue discussing this. The way we operate in the world as human agents is through patterns, and we could talk for this on this now, but that would take another hour or so. But generally, it's through patterns, and when you listen to music, when you experience music, you're doing this on a very fundamental kind of embodied level. So it's not just the case of being an audience member and listening to some Bach and going, "Oh, that's pretty," although that would be nice. Or thinking that it sets the appropriate tone, because it does. We're trying to bring some of the wonderful fruits from the canon, an image of something to strive towards. And when you're talking about Bach's music, it doesn't get much better than that. But also when you listen to music, your mind, psychologically, you're attuning to the patterns that are unfolding. And so it's a process of anticipation. You there are certain things that you expect in music, certain chord progressions, tonal progressions, etc. And then there are disruptions to that. So that's the order and the chaos elements there. manifesting themselves at the compositional level. And so what happens to your mind? Let's say if you're a listener, and you've got to remember that a lot of listeners, they who are arriving at the shows, maybe they've just had a 12-hour day at work, maybe they've just been
Sure.
stuck in traffic for an hour. It's a bit of an adjustment to suddenly rush in through the bar, sit down, and then suddenly hear Jordan speak. So the idea is that audiences can attune their minds to the patterns of the music, and so that when I then exit the stage and Jordan comes on, they're already in that cognitive space, so to speak. And Jordan's been very, 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 very kind and very forthcoming with his thoughts on the music. And he said at sometimes that he feels like he doesn't have to work to get the audience's attention, so to speak, once if there's been a kind of like musical prelude. So that's exactly what we're aiming for.
The music has long been a battleground. This is not just entertainment. There is so much more depth to it. In the more recent sort of musical eras, we've seen the introduction of rock and roll through to heavy metal, etc. We've seen a lot of outcry from certain circles, some very uneducated circles who are simply being reactionary, but also some very valid academic critiques of the more modern direction of music, and really talking about the amplification of chaos, the reduction of order, if I can put it in those terms, almost the rejection of the old. Is music, is it fair to say that music is a kind of a simile, a pattern, a shadow of I guess, the cultural progress that we've seen from the progressive side of politics? Are those two things related? Are they unrelated? Are they caused by different things?
I think they're definitely related. I think musical tastes exist, and we can theorize them in the same way as we could sartorial tastes or culinary tastes. And I mean, sometimes you can read into this too much.
Sure.
But sometimes it's actually useful. If someone was to give you the list of their 5 favorite bands, and then you maybe had to guess their political persuasion, so to speak.
Sure.
That information is might just help you. Or if it doesn't necessarily tell you their political persuasion, it might tell you something about their personality. And so, yeah. And of course, some music, especially in the popular domain, can be overtly political. Obviously, when it's instrumental music, when you don't have the words, some of these things can be more implicit. But even in what we might call classical music or Western art music, from the second half of the 20th century, there are very obvious attempts at kind of like deconstruction, postmodernism, very avant-garde approaches to sound, some of which have a reverence for the past, some of which chuck all that you might consider canonical out of the window. So in answer to your question, yes.
So you're not exactly a stuck in the past kind of stick in the mud, though, because yourself, you're involved in electronic music and you've written and had discourse on this idea of the reinvention of the musical instrument. So talk me through that a little bit, and how do you see music being allowed to progress and to genuinely change as technology and times and tastes change, whilst preserving all that is good about that musical history?
Well, it's important to remember that instruments have always been changing. Always. If we think of the guitar, for example, let's just take that instrument, low-hanging fruit here. What it looked like 250 years ago compared to today.
Sure.
I mean, on the one hand, it's still generally a wooden box with a couple strings across it. You pluck the strings and it creates a vibration. And then if you do that with a number of different notes, you might be able to create a pattern which then can be interpreted and elicit an emotion. I mean, and this goes back thousands and thousands of years. I mean, plucked chordophones, to use the technical term, something that have existed in many cultures for eons. But on the other hand, the guitar is changing rapidly, even at the start of the 20th century. There were only early attempts to electrify the instrument, so to speak, and now we've got to the moving through the kind of the pop rock revolutions. now we've got to the point now where it's a valid question to ask, what even is a guitar anymore? Because when I play, I often use a load of pedals, MIDI pedals, synthesizers, where you can emulate different sounds. And so, like at the O2, when I was doing that version of Ravel's Bolero, laying down kind of like a flute sound and oboe sound, what am I playing there? Am I playing the flute, or am I playing the guitar? Because the flute sounds coming out, and then you start questioning, well, what is a guitar? What is a musical instrument? In this kind of like pluralistic 21st century world that we live in. It's quite a rabbit hole.
It's becoming one of the great questions, right up there with what is a woman. Now, the question I have for you then is, you're now associated with Jordan B. Peterson, and his brand is obviously a juggernaut brand. It's a very polarizing brand. I happen to be a fan of his work. I was at the O2 for a reason. I was at the ARC launch for a reason. I have a lot of respect for what he does and what he talks about, and the effect that he's having. There's a lot of people who equally hate his guts and think that he's a terrible symptom of a world gone horribly, horribly wrong. What's been the impact on you, the social circles that you move in, the academic circles that you move in, your opportunities to teach and so forth? Has the world become a more open place to you since that association, or have you found that you've actually lost a lot of opportunities out of that?
Definitely more.
More, okay.
Definitely more. And I've got to have a number of conversations with a number of leading figures in a number of leading fields that I probably would not have had were it not for the kindness extended to me by Jordan and others in that milieu and certain individuals at Cambridge. And I mean, so you say that he divides opinion, and I would say that's true insofar as anyone divides opinion. I mean, I've spent thousands of hours with him. I don't think I've ever witnessed one negative interaction between him and a member of the public, ever. Which is quite something. Because I see most of my friends have negative interactions with people on the street on a daily basis, like anyone would. And often when occasionally people might say, "Oh, do you agree with him on this or that or whatever?" And it's quite a strange question. I don't agree with my fiance on everything. Sure. I think if I was to drill down to the depths, I think it's almost a natural law that you're bound to almost disagree more than you're bound to with someone, more than you're going to agree with them.
Yeah.
Because even if you both like food, even if you both like the same cuisine, even if you both like the same dish, you've probably got different parts of that dish that you prefer to the other one. So it depends at what level of resolution you want to approach this. So the question is, do you agree with this person on everything? It's like, well, no.
No, of course not.
Do you agree with this person on a huge amount, especially in the philosophical, psychological, religious, musical domain? Overwhelmingly so.
Now tell me about robots playing guitars. This seems like a fascinating area and almost an invitation to disaster. Aren't you at risk of putting yourself out of a job?
No, no. I'm a firm. This isn't my area. I'm a firm believer that robots will never achieve the kind of consciousness that we attribute to humans. There are certain things that they can do. The project that I was involved with, this was early 2019, I believe, at the Institute, what was it, Rhythm in Time Motion Lab at the University of Oslo in Norway, something like that. And so it was, basically trying to robotize guitars. And over the course of that week, the kind of methods that we were using approximated fitting guitars with kind of sensors. So they pick up the sounds around them, and then based on the sounds that they kind of understood, they would then put out, pluck the strings and put out sounds in response to that. So we'd be programming them that if they heard a note of C, for example, to then, splurge out notes within the C major scale. And so we were sticking a number of them in a room, and so the guitars were notionally talking to each other and creating the soundscape where all of the delegates from around the world could move around the space, and it was quite something. It was quite something, and I enjoy pushing in that direction. The kind of level of artistry that these guitars, these robot guitars, are able to achieve will never, I believe, will never reach that of a human agent.
Well, I tend to agree with you when it comes to consciousness on the part of computers. Anyone with I'm 41 years old. You're a young man with incredible accomplishments, so this might be a little bit after your time. But I can remember the very earliest computers when we first began programming them and playing with them. Even at the consumer level, you were working in ones and zeros, or maybe in hexadecimal. You were working in very, very low resolution. Very, 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 very detailed languages where you were literally trying to talk to these things in machine code. And once you understand that that's actually at its core, that's what they do, that's how they work, you come, I think, inexorably to the conclusion that you've expressed there, that they will never achieve actual consciousness. But isn't it possible that they could achieve such a convincing mimicking of consciousness so as to convince a human that they've achieved consciousness? Wouldn't it be possible as the input-output devices develop, you end up with eyes that can cry, you end up with voices that can quiver, you could end up with all manner of things that could convince an interlocutor that they are in fact conscious?
Absolutely. It depends on the human, of course, and the understanding of this. But a number of films that covered this. There was iRobot. I mean, there were a huge number of films, and and the interfaces are very, very important. And also, there's a sense that some people want to believe, and some people want to disbelieve, and so that's an issue as well, which is worth talking about.
Well, speaking of belief, and I think it is worth talking about, religion and music have been intertwined since forever. To what degree do you think the changes that we've seen in music are I guess, symbiotic with, or perhaps even causal with, or what relationship do you think they have with the overall decline in both the quantity and quality of religious belief in Western society? Is there a relationship there?
It's quite a question. That's quite a question. In some sense, you might argue that there is little difference between religion and music. In the sense that if we think of religion in a very broad sense, if we think of it in terms of how we conceive of the transcendent, whatever that might be, whether you're Muslim or Christian or other or non. And so I think for a lot of people, music is their gateway to that which is beyond. And so there was the theologian Balthasar described music as the thinnest veil which separates us from that is beyond. And I think that's wonderful. And you see people in all kinds of contexts feel this. So churches, obvious example.
Sure.
The choir or the congregation are singing, and the hands go in the air in this kind of reverence, this reaching forwards. But isn't that the same thing as you see on a rock concert with people with their hands in their air? Maybe they're doing this instead of a prayer or something. And the emotions that you can see on people's faces in those raw moments. I honestly believe that music is the tool which allows people which allows them to either encourages them to believe, or if they already believe, is the vessel which allows them to explore that even further. And then, of course, there's the whole kind of for a lot of people, beauty is the gateway to the transcendent. So if they are determining something musical as beautiful, then that's another way that they can move in that direction.
It's a great point you make. I remember, and I say this as someone who is a believer. I am a Christian, but I remember watching a video that showed a number of crowd shots, and in that crowd there were people with their hands in the air and tears streaming down their faces, and they were quivering and shaking, and all kind. It looked like a Pentecostal revivalist, event from the 1970s. But in actual fact, it was audience shots from an Elvis concert a few decades prior to that. And of course, the effect that he had on his listeners was profound, and physiological. It would manifest in physiological expressions in much the same way. So it's an interesting question, and one that we can only scratch the surface of here. Unfortunately, I would love to go more deeply into that. Now, your love of sort of tech, your interest in everything from robots to electronic music, etc. Is that related to your interest in NFTs, or is this an entirely separate thing? Can you sort of tell us a little bit about your flirting with NFTs and why you would even devote time to that? What is it about them that you saw value in? Not sorry, when I say value, I'm not necessarily saying financial value, but it was worth you investing time to play with those and learn about those and understand them.
Interesting that you've dragged that up, dragged that up from the depths of the CV. That's something that I'm no longer dealing with, but it was something I was looking at. NFT, particularly NFT marketplaces there, and the people that I was working with, the whole idea was about trying to reform NFTs, so to speak. Because I always had an intrinsic, instinctive, intuitive aversion to the kind of the Bored Ape Club. You've got a little grainy picture, some ape with a cap and a fag hanging out his mouth, and Justin Bieber or Neymar are paying 100 million or whatever it was for this digital image. I could understand how they were being traded, like a stock, like a commodity, but they're in the visual art domain. And they're also in the auditory domain as well. You can have audio NFTs. And so the question was, okay, well, if this is a thing of the future, how about we make them beautiful?
Okay.
And so the person that I was working with, they were looking at bringing on board various artists and looking at ways of bridging the gap between visual arts and the NFTs. So the idea being that I know an artist who did this, who would sell physical artworks, and then with the physical artwork, you'd also get an NFT.
Yeah.
For that. And so you could view that as kind of like taking a plunge into the future and believing in NFTs, or you could also see that as not quite believing in NFTs because you're still relying on the material object. So it was an absolutely fascinating project.
I find NFTs fascinating. The opportunity with them, to me, appears to not be in the NFTs themselves, but in exactly what you've expressed there, as a form of ownership, as a form of title deed. A digital title deed to an existing object makes a lot more sense as a function for NFTs, or as a ticket, as a membership into a club or an event, or these sorts of things. That it seems to make a lot more sense to me as a digital authentication of some other thing. I struggle to see a use case for them in and of their own themselves. I've never owned a Bored Ape. I couldn't understand why people were spending the money they were. And of course, we've seen the market collapse since then. And I think a bit of reality has kicked in. The speculation has ended and reality has kicked in, and people have sat there and gone, yeah, but at the end of the day, it's just a picture of a monkey. I'm not quite sure what I've got here. As you look ahead, I mean, the reason I bring up the NFTs and the reason I bring up the robot, the guitar playing robots and all these sorts of things is because I find you a fascinating person who stands at the crossroads between some really interesting disciplines. And it's all to get to this next phase of what I want to talk about, and that is, where do you see music heading in the future? Do you think it's something that can be anticipated, or do you think it's something that we should just sit back and let it unfold? And if you think you can anticipate, what do you think we're going to see going forwards, and why? What is that an expression of?
Well, I think in terms of looking forwards, trying to hypothesize how things are going to turn out, it would be wise to look at the current trajectory of things. I think we touched on this earlier, and that's a pluralization of musical form and a breaking of boundaries between forms. So I had some students in the past who would say, "Oh, I hate classical music. I never listen. I hate classical music," and I'd say, do you like film music? And they'd say, oh, yeah, I love Hans Zimmer, I love Interstellar, Batman, whatever. And I'd say, there's no difference. There is literally no difference between those two. And I've worked with electroacoustic composers, very much working on the vanguard of marrying acoustic instruments with technological paraphernalia, moving forward there. And so, I mean, if we look at the classical music world or the Western art music tradition currently where it is, it's moving in so many different directions simultaneously. And I think the same can be said for a lot of genres. There's perhaps one genre which I'm a little bit more concerned about, and perhaps that's the most prominent genre, the kind of popular domain.
Sure.
There was some research that came out of Spain, and they did an analysis of I think it was called the Million Song Data Set.
Okay.
And this is popular music songs that have been released over the last 50 years.
Right. There's
So
a million of them.
I think I'm getting pop songs. So
wow.
I think I'm getting the details correct here. But it was a huge data set of songs. But what they found in the popular domain is a general homogenization.
Right.
So the number of lyrics that we use, kind of like the lexical diversity, let's say, over time is becoming smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. And we can use like funny examples to prove our point. You know, the old song by Beyonce or Kesha or whoever. But this is using a huge data set to prove that's the case. And the amount of diversity that exists musically. What do I mean by that? I mean harmonically, the number of chords that are used, the number of tones, the amount of tones in each piece, the number of movements that we made within melodies, for example, are getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And so in answering the question of where music is headed, I would say, well, in some sense, popular music is becoming homogenized. And it's kind of like the modernist kind of grip on what dominates the charts is still very much there. But if we look at contemporary classical music, I mean, it's heading in all directions. If we look at electronic music, if we look at the role of AI in music creation, it's heading everywhere. So there's this kind of tension between the two. And so what I suggest to clients, students, friends, my tired fiance who's fed up of hearing me talk about this, is just listening to a wide variety of music. It's such a rewarding process, and I would say, if I may, that not everyone understands what it means to listen. A lot of people think that if you listen, you sit down and you shut up, and you kind of just information is transmitted to you and you receive it. But that's not the case. And in musicology, this is very much emerged that we can think of listening as an active process. So you can say to someone, you can listen to exactly the same thing, notionally, but you'll both hear very different things.
Sure.
Because a lot of the music is not innate in what you're hearing. The structure is, to a certain extent, it exists within the music, but you're also structuring it yourself in your mind, and so it's not an easy thing to listen. And a lot of people will struggle, if you play them something which is far out of their comfort zone, because they don't really know what they're meant to be listening for.
Yeah,
they don't really know how to listen.
Well, that's that anticipation
so just doing
thing that you were
again
talking about
again
before.
is the way forward.
Sorry, that's the anticipation thing that you were talking about before, with the tension between the order and chaos. It is that element of you feeling that you know what's coming, and then every now and again the composer subverts that expectation, and that's often one of the best parts of a given piece, is when you've been built into a certain expectation, and then the composer takes it off into, or the arranger takes it off into some other direction, can be quite beautiful. I consider myself to have reasonably diverse musical tastes. And I find the study that you mentioned interesting, because I wonder if there's a definitional issue there, where what we define as popular music has in fact narrowed. But even as you said earlier, the range of music that's available now is phenomenally diverse. I mean, if if you just took the range of music that's being listened to a lot as opposed to the range of music that's being played on pop radio stations, you would have metal, you would have rap, you would have all manner of other genres that might completely confound those results. Do you think there's a definitional issue there? Do you think the study is still valuable even with that in mind?
There are always these definitional issues, and I think a good case in point is the recent Spotify Unwrapped.
Mm.
I don't know if you're a
No,
Spotify user yourself.
I'm not familiar with that. No.
It's this thing they do every year. It comes out initially at the end of the year, but it's actually around the 1st of December. And so users get their stats. How many minutes have they listened to music this year on the platform? How many artists? Who's their top artist? What are their top 100 songs? What are their top 5 genres?
Mm-hmm.
And then even this year it was kind of drawing out, it's a bit tongue-in-cheek, a bit silly, but based on the number of genres they were listening to, people were being kind of allocated, or you're a vampire, or you're this, or you're
yeah, okay.
So it can get a bit silly. But what it touches on is that a lot of people I know, they can't resist, myself included, sharing this information is an integral piece of their identity. But the genres that they listened to, and the plurality of genres seems to be like a cause for celebration. If someone's listening to, it's very rare that someone will listen to just a couple of genres, a couple of artists. But if they do, they don't share that because they're not proud of that.
Sure.
The people who listen to a lot have a huge diversity of listening, especially if it's kind of like a wacky conglomeration. That's seen as kind of like a badge of honor. And I think that's definitely, I mean, Spotify, streaming, all of there are issues there, of course. But this kind of public interaction association with musical taste, I think it is cause for celebration.
So the one genre, I said I consider myself to have reasonably diverse taste. There is one genre that I just cannot abide. I cannot get into it. It is literally I will turn around and walk back out of a store if they're playing it because I just can't. So please help me out. Tell me that I'm wrong. Help me to understand this genre so that I no longer have to walk out of stores. I just cannot abide country and western music. Once it has that characteristic twang to it that country western is sort of defined by, I just can't. Can you defend that as a genre of music and help me to get over myself here?
Ironically, it's probably the genre I listen to least as well.
All right, we're in good company. We're in good company.
I mean, how do we want to approach them? We can strip this right back to basics, and we can approach the elements of music. So let's start with the lyrics, the words. With things within that tradition is likely to talk about certain themes, for example.
Hardship,
and so it might be
family.
that those themes are not necessarily of interest to you. Then you touched on the timbre, kind of the twangy thing, the instruments that are used. I don't know, banjo maybe in American kind of
grassroots. Bluegrass.
Kind of, yeah, that kind of thing. The way the melodies are constructed. I mean, not all. I mean, these are huge generalizations I'm making here, but a lot of country music can be quite short in length. I myself am a big progressive rock fan. I like long, elongated pieces, which almost have like classical influence that can merge and meander and metastasize over time. Maybe you don't get that so much. So it might be that if we break it down to those fundamental elements, it's just that there's there's not enough there to resonate with you.
It's interesting. You've actually already helped me to clarify my thinking that the lyrics I often find perfectly agreeable in country music. Often they are about family. They're about hard work. They're about hardship. Sometimes they can be a big whinge. I particularly don't like that. But if it is about just real life, I've got no issue with that. But I think you've helped me clarify. It's two things. It's the what did you call it? The timbre, just that twangy kind of sound. And then also, now that I think about it, so often the vocalist has a whingy kind of a tone to the actual vocals themselves. And now that you actually helped me to think, well, hang on, break it apart and think about it, I think that's what I object to. And I think that's why I just find myself turning around and walking out. I can't abide it. So David,
we take the words, we take the melodies, we just put them in different instruments, give
Present
them
it
a
as a
different
rap
singer.
song. And we're
Okay.
good, we're good at that point. I've got no issue. So, David, you've achieved what most musicians would be dreaming of as they've made the decision. I want to become a musician. That they're putting in the hours, they're doing the work, the music theory, the technique, the repertoire. There's just an enormous investment of hours, weeks, months, years, decades to get to the point where you can perform at an international level in front of thousands and indeed tens of thousands of people. You have now achieved that. You've now done that. You can tick that box. If you had to decide, if you had to now set a goal for yourself, where is it that you're trying to get to? David Cotter, is it a bigger stage? Is it in academia? Is it in technology? What's the objective for you now?
Spreading a love of music, first and foremost. It's my belief that generally music is the thing that most people orient their lives around. Okay, you've got performers and aficionados, but even most people working, let's say the standard 9 to 5, living for the weekend. Let's talk in these terms. What do they do at the weekend? You know, it's concerts, it's shows, but also, I mean, but even more fundamentally than that, in the field of like emotion regulation, what do most people wake up to on their alarm clock? What do they listen to when they're eating breakfast? What do they have in the shower to, get them going for the day? Music underpins our lives, and so music has been theorized for centuries, but there's still so much we don't know, and there are still many people out there who don't necessarily, myself included, understand how this thing we call music actually works. And so delving deeper into that in an academic sense, but then also spreading the good news, so to speak, of what this thing is called music, what it is, and how we can use it, how we can approach it, how we can hold it in reverence, how we can orient our lives around it, how we can use it to motivate us. All of these questions are fascinating, and so to continue teaching, exploring, talking, performing on those topics, that's the plan.
Now, that Jordan B. Peterson tour that you were invited to open for, I believe that tour has come to an end now. Jordan's taking a little bit of time off, is my understanding. Correct me if I'm wrong. Do you anticipate doing more work with him in the future, do you think? Or is that perhaps just that was that tour and now life moves on?
No, absolutely. We're in conversation, and there are plans are brewing.
Good.
Let's say. I mean, he's always full of ideas. He's very much creative in that sense of the word, and a connector as well, and makes things happen, and inspires a lot of the people around him. So there are some things brewing, and if we get to speak again, let's say in a year or so, I'm sure we could reflect on those.
No, look, I look forward to that because I certainly appreciated your work. I had no idea who you were, and I showed up to the O2 Arena after 3 days of the ARC launch. I'd personally chatted with Jordan Peterson on 3 separate occasions. I was there with the Aussie Wire, and we brought a photographer over, Carly Soderstrom, who is actually the photographer that's taken Jordan's favourite photo of himself. And the one that he uses all over his social media was taken by Carly in Melbourne, and so we brought her over to London to update Jordan's photographs. And I chatted with him on multiple occasions and found him to be just as interesting in person as what he is to listen to when he's being interviewed. And so I showed up to the O2 Arena. I felt pretty well understanding what it was that I was in for after 3 days of the ARC conference. And then, of course, you opened. And I just thought it was a beautiful, beautiful way to set the mood and get everybody into that. And then, as I mentioned before, when you made the switch between the acoustic and the electric guitar, it achieved exactly what you've expressed, and certainly sucked everybody in and made us all go, ooh, this might be a little bit different. And it's just a wonderful way to open the event. Well, David Cotter, unless you've got something else burning a hole in the back of your mind that you really want to express, I'm just going to say thank you so much for your time.
Well, it's been an absolute pleasure speaking. Yes, we could go on for many more hours, I'm sure. But another day, I look forward to it.
Well, as do I, and I look forward to seeing you again, whether it's at a Jordan Peterson event or at some other function. I'm heading over to the US next year and hopefully to the UK as well a little bit later on. Hopefully our paths will cross at some point and we'll be able to have a bit of a sit-down chat in person. But until then, David Cotter, what a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us here on an Aussie Wire Deep Dive.
Thank you.